Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Winifred Sullivan. I'm the chair of the Department of Religious Studies at IU, and this is the first lecture of our fall lecture series. I just wanted to tell you, give you a heads up about the next one before we go on. Our second lecture will be on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, September 16th, also at 5:30 here in the Hoagie Carmichael room. The lecturer will be Courtney Bender of Columbia University, and her title is The Work of Art in the Age of Inarticulate Religion. So, this afternoon's lecture is supported by the James S. Ackerman Lecture Fund. The Lecture Fund is rather a special treat that we have in the department. It was established by an anonymous donor, in honor of the work of Jim Ackerman, who's sitting over there, who is emeritus in the department. Professor Ackerman has been a leader over his long career in the Bible as literature movement in the U.S., a distinguished scholar of biblical literature. Jim spent several decades teaching summer programs for high school teachers to teach them to teach the biblical text as literature. And in that role, as well as in his role as undergraduate and graduate teacher at IU, he's influenced really generations, I would say, of biblical scholars. And he himself continues to write and publish on the biblical texts. So we are really delighted to be able, once again, to honor Jim with this Ackerman lecture. And we thank the anonymous donor, whoever he, she, or they are. So let me now introduce today's speaker. Professor Yvonne Sherwood is Professor of Biblical Cultures and Politics in the Department of Religious Studies and the School of European Languages and Cultures at the University of Kent in the UK. Professor Sherwood holds a PhD from the University of Sheffield in England. She has published extensively on what she calls the afterlives of the biblical texts. She's interested in how they live on and what work they do in their later lives. And she has many interesting publications on these topics. She's the author, most recently, of Biblical Blaspheming, Trials of the Sacred for a Secular Age, from Cambridge University Press. I first met Yvonne several years ago at a seminar at the University of Michigan on secularism. And we have met and corresponded over the years here and in the UK. It's really a pleasure for me personally to have her here and to invite her to meet you all and our colleagues. Yvonne is the kind of colleague who honors you, in my experience, by radically reorienting what you thought you were saying. Her generous spirit and fierce intelligence does not admit of half measures. You are in for a treat. Her title today is the Abrahamic Hagaramic, or Abraham the Non-European. Yvonne.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. When we were circling over, where are we? Indianapolis. When we were circling over Indianapolis in the plane last night and actually ended up landing in Cincinnati and taking a bus overnight, I wondered whether we would actually make it, and it's wonderful to be here. It's particularly wonderful to be able to give a tribute to James Ackerman, who is, and I'm sure many of you have read his work, an absolutely wonderful biblical scholar. When I first moved across to biblical studies from literature and felt rather unhomed in a very sort of strange place, it was some of his work on literary analysis of biblical texts that really made me feel at home. And his article on Jonah was an article, one of the few academic articles that's actually made me laugh out loud. So it's a real honour to be able to give this lecture as a tribute to his wonderful work in biblical studies. Okay, there's a handout with the lecture if you didn't get one on the way in. It's just a few biblical texts. We'll be doing a little bit of biblical studies as we go along, but don't be scared. So my title is the Hagaramic, or Abraham the Non-European. When trying to ground what we mean by Europe, or its Western alter ego, America, we often tend to appeal to some Christian or Judeo-Christian foundation and a certain relation to the Bible, as opposed to, say, and of course the example is not just accidental, the Quran. But what is the nature of this Christian biblical foundation? What kind of origin or ground does it provide? In previous work, I've argued that the origin is not like a solid concrete plinth on which Westernness and modernity is erected. It's not solid, like those concrete monuments of the Ten Commandments that are sometimes erected and dismantled in the grounds of courthouses in the USA. Christian or biblical origins are not solid, even less a solid point of reference dense with detail. They are empty and vacant, but vacant in a particular sense. Christian or biblical origins are certainly not vacant in the sense that they are nothing, non-existent. We are not and never have been secular in this sense. Biblical origins are vacant, not because they are nothing, but because we understand their key virtue as kenosis, their unique ability to sacrifice themselves and empty themselves out. The particular virtue of the Christian legacy lies in its mortability, its ability to die. Because it's able to die, it rises again and lives eternally as a kind of spirit, exactly like Christ. The English 17th century, the time of civil war and revolution, and also the first migrations to America, created a new theological political understanding of the true meaning of the Bible that enabled the Christian to coexist with proto-modern constitutions and the rights of man. Uniquely, and unlike any other scriptures, the Bible, it turned out, did not want to mess in law and politics directly. It did not want to be cited in detail. Just like the Christ, who, though in the form of God, did not count equality a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, say Philippians, the Christian Bible and the Christian God humbled themselves and devolved power. The idea is that thanks be to God, and specifically thanks be to the Christian Protestant God, the Bible has always been in favour of the replacement or neutering of all sovereigns, earthly and divine. As one Whig lawyer put it in the late 17th century, the heathen still call their gods Jupiter, which he takes to mean, by a hokey etymology, juris pater, the father of the law. Foreign heathen gods and kings misunderstand themselves as theocrats, godfathers, authors of the law who can dispense with their own law at whim, holding us subject to the vagaries of their voices, the intricacies of their texts. Benign English law, by contrast, confesses that the laws are, quote, grounded originally upon the divine law as their foundation or fountain, but concedes this as a technical point of piety, affirming that, quote, more immediately human laws have their force and authority from the consent and agreement of men. The particular foundation that Christianity gives to modern politics is like a fountain. It's a source, a tap, bubbling forth freedom. But it does not know or seek to control with a freedom like the Spirit will go, once released from the dead letter of the text. I wonder if someone could put the first slide on. Thank you. This declaration that only foreign deities and kings understand themselves as theocrats, godfathers, but that a true Christian polity understands the divine voice as foundation or fountain, was made as a riposte to an argument made in the English law courts in 1686, that just as the God of Abraham had dispensed with his own law and commanded Abraham to carry out the illegal murder of his son, so the king could dispense with the law that he had made. This rather unhelpful model of King Abraham was decorously ushered out of politics. Whig lawyers and writers like Nathaniel Morton, the first historian of the settlement of the Plymouth colony, produced a very different political model of Abraham as vague foundation and source for the desires of the modern state. In 1669, Morton declared that we, the seed of Abraham his servant, and the children of Jacob his chosen, inherit fundamental concepts such as the intervention of the people in public affairs, the free voting of taxes, and personal liberty from the legacy of the Bible as a fount of freedom. Abraham now stands for a political covenant. The biblical foundation protects us, it securitizes us against any, quote, principle or divine prince that goes against the covenant between God and man in the moral law, and the politic covenants and constitutions among men themselves. Over the last years, we've witnessed a return of Abraham, or the Abrahamic, to public discourse. In a piece of paternalistic politicalese pronounced in the wake of 9/11, Tony Blair affirmed that Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all children of Abraham, and this is the moment to bring the faiths closer together in the understanding of our common value and heritage. In his post-political career, Blair has spearheaded the Faith in Globalization initiative, jointly sponsored by the Div School and the School of Management at Yale. The alliance of divinity and management is appropriate, since the objective is to manage divinities and to encourage good religion, allied with freedom and the free market economy, a task in which the fraternal Abrahamic is expected to play a lead role. In the Bible, Abraham begat Isaac, also Ishmael, who begat Jacob, also Esau, and we'll talk about these awkward other brothers in a moment. In the altogether neater history of public concepts, ethical monotheism begat the Judeo-Christian, which then latterly begat the Abrahamic. In our conceptual genealogies, the Abrahamic is not the grandfather, but the last-born son. First came ethical monotheism, encompassing universalism, ethics, the neat relation between the one God and the single ethical subject, good citizenship, social justice, values in a general but always positive sense. The oneness of ethical monotheism also provided a template for religion that can be gently plural while remaining manageably and essentially one. The successor or companion to ethical monotheism was a Judeo-Christian, a term that evokes the most ancient of origins but is in fact of recent vintage, in fact barely antique, a little more than 100 years old. The hyphenated alliance of Judeo-Christian, first minted in the late 19th century, became popular in the 1930s, 40s and 50s in the context of World War II, the Shoah, and the Cold War. As a riposte to the Nazi pejorative Juden-Christlich, in which the Jewish is marked as a contaminant which threatens and sullies Christianity, the term Judeo-Christian affirmed Judaism as one of the three fighting faiths of democracy. Protestantism and Catholicism were the other two. In the wake of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and campaigns for civil rights, and the resulting identity crises, a term first coined in 1954, secular democracies came under increasing pressure to publicly perform hospitality to the ethnic, religious, and sexual other, while also managing and regulating difference through conceptual and actual border control. The rise of identity, understood as a persisting entity, or the quality or condition of being the same as something else, led to new ways of thinking about religious representation and what kinds of religious identities could be represented. Public religious identities had to be ancient, persistent, and communal, big enough to be counted and to count. These imperatives contributed to the rise of the new amalgam, the Judeo-Christian, followed by the Abrahamic. Under the pressure of identity, religious groupings are getting ever more ancient, ever larger, more compelling, and perhaps ever more vague. The Judeo-Christian implies an openness combined with essence and conformity. The same work couldn't be done by the terms, say, secular Christian or Hindu Christian or Muslim Christian. In the Judeo-Christian, multiculturalism is gestured to and managed. By taking a group whose differences are masked by proximity to the Christian, for example, sharing roughly the same Bible, the Judeo-Christian implies a structure of welcome dependent on embracing the fundamental values of the welcoming group. In the conceptual culture wars, the Judeo-Christian has proved hospitably plastic and vague. In the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower invoked the Judeo-Christian concept of all men created equal against the threefold public enemy: communism, Korea, and corruption. In 1958, the economist Elgin Grosclose proclaimed that ideas drawn from the Judeo-Christian scriptures have made possible the economic strength and industrial power of this country. The Republican Senator Barry Goldwater declared that the communist projection of man as a producing, consuming animal to be used and discarded was antithetical to all the Judeo-Christian understandings, which are the foundations upon which the Republic stands. The Judeo-Christian conjured the illusion of cultural solidity and foundation while functioning as an empty space capable of accommodating a whole range of goods, including industrialism, capitalism, humanism, democracy, and equality, a filing cabinet of values, collectively standing for value in a conveniently blurred economic and moral sense. And then along came Abraham. These days, the Judeo-Christian seems a little outdated, in contrast to the far more contemporary name of old Abraham. The Blairish voice of liberalism is now much more likely to use the relatively new public term, the Abrahamic, suggesting a reaching out to Islam. Abraham and the Abrahamic stand in hospitable contrast to the logic of contrast, the clash of civilizations which sets the Judeo-Christian against Islam. Whereas once the perceived task of Christendom was to hold back the Turks or Moors or Saracens or Mohammedans or Muslims or Hagarenes or Ishmaelites bearing down on Europe's gates, now the model is that of opening the gates, provided that those who seek to enter meet the requisite entrance criteria. The Abrahamic proclaims that Jews, Muslims, and other good religionists are free to join the religio-political judicial alliance of equality and freedom, while remembering that fundamental values such as free elections and personal liberty have a particular Christian pedigree and genealogy. This claim becomes more acceptable the more Christianity does not simply name itself as itself, but sees itself as opening out into the Judeo-Christian and the Abrahamic, even as it will never quite let go of its own particular paternity suit on democracy and specifically modern or Western values, such as freedom and rights. The Abrahamic fraternity to which the brother religions are called is Abrahamic, not Abrahamic, or as Jacques Derrida provocatively puts it, Abrahamic. Abraham is an ironic and iconic figure of hospitality. He famously welcomes the three figures at the Oaks of Mamre. The old name is domestic, recognisable, and also a little manageably and modestly foreign. It implies friendship with brothers in places such as Palestine, Iraq, and Egypt, without doing anything other than imply that all these regimes' citizens are equally vaguely religious, and without giving any clue as to what talk of the Abrahamic might mean in the context of Israel-Palestine, revolution and counter-revolution in Egypt, or the Arab Spring. We can talk pie-eyed about the Abrahamic, while the real work goes on at the level of economy, oil prices, or complex discourses on strategy in the idioms of international relations. Perhaps this is a point of the Abrahamic. It's a nice phrase, but something from the old archives of the religious, the retired emeritus past of the Bible, and relatedly, fraternally, but also deeply controversially for Euro-America, the Quran. The Abrahamic bespeaks good intentions without content. It's strangely empty, even vacuous, a perfect meeting place because nothing essential takes place there. The appeal of Abraham is that he is the man, the Punkt and the Treffpunkt, but not central. In a place before the centre, he's not Christ, Moses, Torah, Muhammad, or the Quran. Thus Abraham is everything and nothing. He's the no religions land that is every religion's land, or at least the three Abrahamic's religions land. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity can gather as brothers under one father, under the capacious tent of Abraham, and do so all the more easily because this father is not at the centre of the three religions he seems to found. The name of Abraham holds out the promise of a dim and distant background, a desert which has not yet been built on, without any green lines, security fences, or apartheid walls. He's the place where we can all get together before the difference starts. As the inaugurator of a generalised and universalisable monotheism, he's pre-Mosaic, before the law, before all the specifics of the law and Sharia or halakha. He represents the beginning that can be understood as the beginning of everyone and everything. Dressing up his new Gentile friends as children of Abraham, Paul strategically turned Abraham into a figure of the promise in general and belief in general. Abraham, the believer, content and specific. Expanding on this Pauline tradition, the Abrahamic offers a welcome to all comers, providing that they leave all controversial differences, all adiaphora, at the door. To put this another way, membership in the fraternity of the Abrahamic comes through sacrifice. Abraham, or Ibrahim, is famous above all for sacrifice, or more accurately, the near sacrifice of his son. Nowadays, the bland Abrahamic is associated with the call to sacrifice in a different sense. To enter into the political covenant of the Abrahamic, a religion must offer up all fanaticisms, literalisms, and secrets, all those aspects of the old religious archive or contemporary religious practice that do not meet the standards required for public representation and a public face. But Abraham also stands as a sign of those who stand outside the liberal, vague Abrahamic and imitate another kind of Abraham, those who still listen to the voices of sovereign gods, even when they collide with political covenants and commit violence in God's name. Abraham also stands as a sign of the knife or bomb-wielding terrorist. The call to the Abrahamic coexists with a recognition and fear of an uncomfortable surplus of religion that refuses to acquiesce to the goals of the Abrahamic and what it seeks to manage and represent. My gambit today is that there's subversive political potential in taking a vaguely referenced and emptied out Christian biblical foundation and restoring it as a seething and problematic text. There are some extraordinary precedents for this in 20th century European cultural and philosophical history. For example, secularized German Jews of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s were unleashing the Bible as a network of force, prophecy, and fissure, just a few years before public discourse in America was jumping on the bandwagon of the vaguely Judeo-Christian and other vague repackagings of the biblical foundation. For example, in a letter to Franz Rosenzweig in 1926, Gershom Scholem warned that the Bible would not be content to be absorbed in Zion as a quiescent foundation, a manual of secularized Hebrew vocabulary. The biblical as an uneasy and potentially explosive combination of the conservative, the visionary, the restorative, and the utopian was like a volcano. And the volcano god would surge up through the biblical ground of Zion, taking his revenge. In Mimesis, Erich Auerbach, a German Jew who sought refuge in Istanbul during the Second World War, overlaid the Bible, and particularly Genesis, on fissured and ruined European landscapes. The Judeo-Christian foundation was foundational because it was a broken foundation, staging fatal ruptures between siblings, broken origins, backgroundedness, overdetermination and force and complication, particularly domestic complications, struggles, fighting at home. Interpretations, or better, detonations of the biblical like these, staged a stubborn biblical literalism or a fundamentalism. At the same time, they refused to do what biblical scholars were trained to do and contain the text as a text. The biblical corpus became a force field of fissure, prophecy, augury, curse, alienation, and promise, a means of scrambling the times in the resurgence of the atavistic biblical, which refused to lie down as a retired sovereign, a sort of passive, vacant, emeritus text. For figures like Auerbach and Scholem, the biblical bored down into the land. It overlaid its fissures onto our geographies. It became a fact on and in the ground, and took away the solid ground of origin beneath our feet. Similarly, for Freud, in that strange and haunting work of the late 1930s, Moses and Monotheism. Freud, who gave us a topographical conception of the mental apparatus, overlaid the biblical story of Moses on a map of Europe, which, like the Freudian psyche, was radically unhoned and estranged. For Freud, the mental life is, quote, an apparatus consisting of several hierarchies, districts, and provinces. In Freud's Moses, states of mind blur with states in the other sense, and the collapse and breaking up of states. History, says Freud, loves the restorations in which later fusions are redissolved and former separations again become apparent. He loves the way in which, for example, the Reformation restored the old European fissure between the Roman and the Germanic, or the way in which, he claims, the old truths of the foreignness of Moses and the murder of Moses rise up from awkward sutures in the text. For Freud, the biblical corpus becomes a place where old fissures are restored and made whole and strange again. Boldly and infamously, Freud claims that ethical monotheism, circumcision, and Moses were all Egyptian. In this, he seems to perversely follow the same logic as the Hebrew prophets and the psychoanalysis. Truth is unbearable, unbelievable. We can tell how true a thesis or a prophecy is by how much it hurts, alienates, and repels. His aim is to attack supposed national interests in the interest of truth, and estrange Jewishness and Europeanness from its own roots. The stimulus for monotheism, he says, came from outside, from a great stranger. Freud nudges the origins of monotheism outside Judaism and outside Europe, east of Europe, to the wrong part of the so-called Middle East, Egyptian, Arabic, not biblical, not that part of the Semitic, seen as an intimate relation and predecessor for the European. Moses, he says, was an Egyptian priest or noble who wanted to resuscitate the dying god of monotheism, who had flourished briefly during the reign of Akhenaten. And for this purpose, he took on the Hebrews, or as he says, the Semitic Neo-Egyptians, to be his people, to be used as a kind of secondary storage system for the spiritual monotheism that had nearly died. Thus, he says, monotheism is genetically Egyptian, but historically Jewish. I wonder if I have the next slide. Thanks. The assault and the enigma of Freud's Moses was taken up by Edward Said in his 2001 lecture, Freud and the Non-European. And I think this is one of the most wonderful book covers that I've ever seen, the kind of doubling of Europe and Europe appearing as a kind of grey spectre, or a bat, or a bird, or a kind of Rorschach inkblot test. Freud, says Said, embodies the parochialism of the European. His Egypt is the orientalized Egypt of romanticized antiquity. Freud may make the psyche strange to itself, but all the models of the alien, the unheimlich, resurgent, primitive, or savage at the heart of civilization come from the Greco-Roman or Judeo-Christian corpus, or accounts of primitive tribes by Fraser and Robertson Smith. And yet, despite his provincialism, Freud points to the actuality of the non-European as a constitutive presence as a sort of fissure in the figure of Moses. By insisting that Jewish identity did not begin with itself, but rather with other identities, Egyptian and Arabian, Freud perceived, before the rise of identity politics, the timely lesson that identity cannot be thought or worked through itself alone. It cannot constitute or even imagine itself without that radical originary break or flaw which will not be repressed. My contention this evening is that this particular epiphany, that identity didn't begin with itself, but rather with other identities, and that specifically what we might call Jewish identity is also Egyptian and Arabian, is there in glorious technicolor on the surface of the biblical text, not in Genesis, not in Exodus, but in Genesis. We can find it in what I'm calling the Hagaramic, the dogged shadow and precursor of the Abrahamic. Who is Hagar and what is the Hagaramic? Hagar, of all women in the Bible, seems to merit being exaggerated, like Abraham, into a condition, period, or quasi-scientific concept, the Hagaramic. Not only is she promised myriad descendants, but her name is evoked in the curiously named tribe, the Hagarites and the Hagarenes, which I'm sure you all know you can find in 1 Chronicles and Psalm 83. Earlier, I discussed how the term Abraham generalizes and universalizes a proper name, and so appeals to particular religious identities, particular religious histories, but also seems to name a transcendental principle, condition, or origin, the Abrahamic. The Hagaramic names specific histories, but also a conflicting shadow principle of origin, the principle of overdetermination and hollowing out of origin. I find it profoundly provocative that the Abrahamic, that overtly masculine, paternal, fraternal concept, has a female foreign shadow or prototype, facilitator of the Abrahamic family, thorn in the side of the Abrahamic family, the Egyptian slave Hagar, meaning Hagar, the resident alien. The ger is not the foreigner, there's another word for foreigner, nokri or nokria, but the resident alien, the alien living with us in our house. The Hagaramic names an uncanny body and story so close to us that it impinges on our place. The Hagaramic is the thought of the foreigner whose intimacy with the Abrahamic is as close as could possibly be conceived. Hagar is literally all over the place, and she's impossible to place. She wanders to and fro in the no man's or no women's land between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I just want to touch on some of the texts on your handouts, which some of you might be familiar with and others not. To start with Galatians 4, 21 to 31, here Paul constructs an elaborate tortured allegory contrasting the son of the slave woman, Hagar, with the son of the free woman, Sarah. The Hagar side of the allegory is unfocused, geographically diffuse. Galatians 4:25 is very strange. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. Hagar is Jewish and also Arab. In a Freudian displacement, Jerusalem is airlifted to and conflated with Arabia, perhaps to make a distinct place for Pauline Christianity that seems already to be headed out of Jerusalem towards Rome and the West. The conflation of Jerusalem and Arabia seems strangely faithful to Hagar's story back in Genesis. In Genesis, she has sex with Abraham and conceives a son, Ishmael, who's presumably half Abrahamic and half Egyptian, half Arab and half Jew, to use terms that are anachronistic for the book of Genesis. There's two Hagar stories in Genesis 16 and 21, stories about Hagar being taken into the Abrahamic house and then expelled from the Abrahamic house. In Genesis 16, Hagar is sent out of the Abrahamic house pregnant with Ishmael, and she goes back to Shur on the way to Egypt, and she's met by a divine messenger who tells her to return. In Genesis 21, she's cast out with her son Ishmael, who's saved from death with the revelation of a spring of water in the desert. And the two go back to Egypt, never to return to the book of Genesis. They wait a few hundred years and then enter Islam. The moment in Genesis 21:19 where God opens Hagar's eyes and she sees a spring of water relates in Islam to the foundation of the holy city of Mecca. Her name, pronounced in Arabic with a soft G, Hagar, becomes one of the centres of the Hajj, and her quest for water is remembered in the rituals of the Hajj. Ostracised from Genesis, Hagar and Ishmael take up residence in Islam. And now I want to concentrate on the biblical origin story of Hagar, which I think is extremely curious, as I'll try and explain. First of all, Hagar is a necessary supplement to the Abrahamic family. Abraham, which means mighty father, is promised descendants as numerous as sand on the seashore or stars in the sky. But the mighty father has immense difficulty in becoming father, just as he experiences massive impotence in securing the promised land. By the end of the Abrahamic saga, he's managed to secure just a grave-sized piece of Canaan for a grave for Sarah and eventually himself, and this through 20 verses of negotiation and the payment of the astronomical sum of 400 shekels of silver to the Hittites, who possessed this piece of land. Abraham is famously called to go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, in order to be made into a great nation, in Genesis 12. Just 6 verses later, the deity or the narrator adds a not insignificant caveat with a bit of throat clearing that the Canaanites were then in the land. The promise appears in glorious technicolor, but then comes the small print, the terms and conditions. 3 chapters later, God is conceding that there is at least a 400-year time-set delay on the realization of the promise. The world of Abraham might not know about the Mosaic Torah, but it does know about the Exodus. It does know that, quote, your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves for 400 years. Similarly, no son, no fatherhood. Abraham can't be father until he has a son, and Sarah, like all the matriarchs, is barren. According to Genesis 18, it has ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women, but not, it turns out, after the manner of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Later in Genesis, Sarah conceives Abraham's second son, Isaac, pretty much after the manner of Mary, later to be promoted to the Virgin Mary. Genesis 21, verse 1. Now the Lord visited, not as the English translation decorously has it, dealt with Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he promised. Sarah conceived. 10 years and 5 chapters into the Abrahamic saga, Abraham and Sarah get tired of waiting for the promised son, and they take matters, which is to say they take Hagar, into their own bodies and hands. Genesis 16 verse 2, you see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children from her, or literally be built up from her, says Sarah. Next slide. European art has relished this biblical alibi for eroticism and nudity. For example, here in the Dutch painting, Adrian van der Werf's Sarah representing Hagar to Abraham of 1699. The painting, which enraged and titillated Dutch Calvinists, seems to me to echo the sacrifice. If you can just go back 2 slides. So here you've got Abraham, the patriarch, negotiating with another figure over the sort of abject white body of the son. And then if you go back to the other image, and here we've got Abraham negotiating with Sarah about the future of the abject white body of the slave. The Hagaramic, for me, names the tortured Genesis of Genesis. First question, probably the most important one. Why present the origin as needing the supplement of the Egyptian slave. Admittedly, it's impossible to approach or think the origin as essence, purity, virginity, and sole possession. But Genesis doesn't just flounder on the difficulty, it insists on the point and goes to the opposite extreme. The slave is not simply subservient to the master story. The origin does not and cannot happen without the essential supplement or surrogate. How strange to have a story in which the origin cannot take place without Hagar, the resident alien. We see the mistress supplicating surrogate life from the body of the slave. God seems unable to give without assistance. Surely it would have been possible for the absolute God of monotheism to offer the gift of a single origin within a united family. In short, the perfect gift. What do we make of the fact that the God of monotheism, the one, the Abrahamic God no less, seems least able to give this gift? Hagar, for me, seems to point to the curious, if not perverse, feature of the book of Genesis, all these tortured genealogies, origins that are bastard and also mixed. To take another example, the names of the ancestors, two key ancestors, the names of the land, are Israel and Judah. Israel, nay Jacob, has to wrestle with his twin brother Esau down the birth canal, and then, since he doesn't actually emerge first, work to displace him in order to get primacy and to secure or be the land. But even stranger is the tortuous genealogy of Judah, which is told in Genesis 38. Judah marries a Canaanite, as if to say overtly Israelite is mixed with Canaanite. Then he has sex with his daughter-in-law when she's disguised as a prostitute, leading to another twin pregnancy in which a son called Breach, or Perez, overtakes his twin brother down the birth canal. The question, who or what is the line of Judah, is answered perversely and maybe even half-smilingly with the genealogy. The descendants of Judah, formerly married to a Canaanite, who then had sex with Tamar, his daughter-in-law, when she was disguised as a prostitute, leading to the birth of warring twins. You can see why I think that the origin stories in Genesis could be a little bit more simple. The biblical Hagaramic functions as a surrogate Abrahamic. Her surrogacy is biological and textual. A surrogate is someone who can take the place of another, especially as a successor, and replace. According to the Babylonian law code of Hammurabi, a barren wife should offer her servant or concubine as a surrogate. Genesis reflects the same principle. Hagar stands in for the body of Sarah so that she may be built up by her. Hagar provides boy bricks for the Abrahamic house. But her active textual surrogacy is even more remarkable and destructive. The level of textual surrogacy here is shocking and deliberate. In Genesis 21, Ishmael is expelled when Sarah sees him yitzhaking, which means to play, but also to be Isaac, to mimic Isaac. This mimicry, Ishmael being Isaac, playing at Isaac, is played out in dense mimicry between Hagar and Ishmael on one hand, and Sarah, Abraham, and Isaac on the other. Abraham is a resident alien, just like Hagar. He follows in the footsteps of Hagar, or maybe Hagar follows his. Abraham is not autochthonous or aborigine. He's not made from the ground like Adam. He's a divinely called immigrant from in Babylon, modern-day Iraq, called to occupy an unknown land as colonizer and pioneer. The Hagaramic is the name for all those others who are already in the land and there before the eponymous ancestors of Israel. The land is not just not empty, it's full. It's sprawling with, according to Genesis 15, Kenites, Kenizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites, etc., etc. Come to the next slide. The Renaissance humanist Benito Arias Montana got the cluttered demographics just right in his pedantically literalist map of Canaan in the time of Abraham. You probably can't read the words, but they're all the names of different tribes splattered across the map. Far from an ancient desert utopia, Canaan looks rather like Manhattan. Faithful to the biblical record, Montano crowns the land with no less than 31 kingdoms and tribes. And then the others just keep on coming. Before the eponymous ancestor of Israel comes the twin, the other brother, who's there before him, or the surrogate family lurking just outside the tent. Before Jacob comes Esau, before Isaac, Ishmael. We are the second-born son who has to wrestle, struggle, and displace. Whence this strange kamikaze desire to present our ancestor as the one who had to wrest the blessing from the firstborn, or push the other family into the desert to make enough room for us? And why keep this act of dispossession on record? Why not indulge in the luxury and consolation of origin as a self-authenticating, self-consolidating fantasy space? To put it crudely, if you want to write a people out, you can do it quite easily through a simple act of texticide, a form of elimination that's relatively painless. This would all be part of a normal day's work for Hebrew narrative. Hebrew narrative is famously terse. It's always deselecting detail. Not just detail that we would consider superfluous, but detail that we would have preferred to have kept in. Goddesses, daughters, mothers, and details are regularly elided. So the Hagaramic names the strange principle of keeping the expelled elder, whose surplus to requirements on record, as if we owe them a debt of recognition, of memory, or the archive. The others are presented as the ultimate enemy, but also the ones as close to us as could possibly be conceived, cohabiting in the same womb, entering the house of the patriarch and allowing the patriarch to enter them. Origin in Genesis is presented as cohabitation, doubling, but also splitting, so the two ancestors separate. But the way in which those stories of division are told split our sympathies. Sometimes they tempt us to side with our ancestor. Sometimes they push us to empathise with the alien, to the point where our narrative is damaged and distressed. Esau, Jacob's brother, is a stooge who's duped. He's the object of a joke. But he's also the one who screams out when he's tricked by our ancestor, "Bless me also, and have you only one blessing?" This is a very good question. Why does monotheism only have one blessing? Why is blessing scarce? The story of the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael is told very explicitly as a reverse exodus, with the Israelite house standing in for Egypt as the place of oppression. And then the sensational Hollywood pinnacle of the Abrahamic, the sacrifice of Isaac, is actually preceded by a far less famous prototype one chapter earlier in Genesis 21. Sensationally, the sacrifice of Isaac tells of the Abrahamic's virtual self-destruction, Isaac and the whole future of Abraham under the knife. But the Abrahamic risks itself and threatens to destroy its own uniqueness far more effectively, if less sensationally, by having Genesis 22 preempted by Genesis 21, the story of Hagar's expulsion and the last-minute retrieval of Ishmael from the brink of death. As if dead set on textual twinning or textual surrogacy, the first sacrifice tenaciously follows, or rather precedes the second, in numerous points of detail, from getting up early to the intervening angel and the son snatched from death. Exceptionally for a woman, and especially an Egyptian woman, Hagar steals the thunder of the Abrahamic and the patriarchal prerogative in general. The Hagaramic seems to detract from the uniqueness, primacy, and oneness of the Abrahamic name. She's the first to bear a son and the first to receive a divine visitation, 2 full chapters before Abraham welcomes the 3 divine guests. Even more strangely, she becomes a quasi-patriarch. Remember those Hagarites and Hagarims, receiving a direct repetition of the Abrahamic promise, "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude," Genesis 16:10, a repetition of the promise just given by God to Abraham just a chapter previously, for all the world, as if it were going to be unique.
It's as if Hagar takes over a domestic narrative that never gets to be properly domesticated and insular, because the Egyptian slave always already does things that only the patriarchs get to do, and first. Acting out all the patriarchal prerogatives, she names her own progeny and she names God, and then she puts a signpost in the landscape just like the patriarchs, naming a well as a sign of her encounter with the God who hears. Just as Hagar troubled the old Abrahamic house, it seems to me that the Hagaramic disturbs the bland placidity of the common term, the Abrahamic, and all the dreams of freedom, fraternity, and identity that the Abrahamic represents. Against the loose idea that biblical Judeo-Christian Abrahamic foundations gush forth political covenants of freedom, the Hagaramic suggests, in the words of the Iraqi poet Amal al-Jaburi, that freedom may be a bastard child, an orphan without a name. Hagar names the repressed memory of the old biblical patriarch as an Iraqi national, so to speak, an immigrant to Canaan who has sex and has a child with the Egyptian-Arabian alien in his house. The Hagaramic names an itinerant truth that attacks national interests, the resurgent memory of the great, or maybe negligible stranger that estranges origin from itself. The estrangement from monogenealogy and unity and universality goes down deep, all the way down to the Bible, and all the way to the foundation of Christendom and Europe. Islam, Hagar, is not a new problem for Europe and Euro-America. Europe was constituted in the face-to-face with Islam, and in a different but related way in the face-to-face with the figure of the Jew. In his book About Europe, Philosophical Hypotheses, Denis Guénon argues provocatively that it's the failure of universality that defines Europe. Europe was constituted as a particular geographical zone of retreat and self-securitization against Islam. The origins of Europe are as anxious and crowded and overdetermined as biblical origins. As Guy Stroomster reminds us, our European predecessors were acutely aware that the religious identity of Europe was manifold and always pointed eastward. The Muslim Turks were at the gates of Vienna, and the roots of Christianity were known to lie in Palestinian Judaism. Perhaps the new term, the Abrahamic, can be read as an attempt to stabilize and securitize our religious identities by anxiously retrojecting the universalism and ground that has never existed. In fact, as Stroomster puts it, only recently has the Christian identity of Europe become a source of narcissistic self-satisfaction, a self-satisfaction now sometimes broadened to include its Judeo-Christian or even Abrahamic roots. Even, especially in the Bible, that presumed bastion of oneness and security, there's always more than one God, always more than one family, always more than one way of defining the family as proto-nation. Genesis experiments with different, often wild, geneses of family. In a way that's shocking for those who expect the Bible to represent family or indeed national values, it experiments with exogamy, endogamy, and incest in the attempt to find the best or most legitimate ways of forging and sustaining groups. Can one sleep with a daughter-in-law or marry a sister? How foreign is the Ishmaelite, the half-brother of Isaac and the son of Abraham, or the Edomites, Israel's twin? Under what terms or conditions can a resident alien become us? And with what remainder, what caveats, what terms and conditions that still separate the full citizen from those without papers? Against the bland principle of general hospitality represented by the Abrahamic, the Hagaramic suggests a darker, grittier negotiation of the family and nation and relation, always related to the limits of land and resources, always fought out on the ground. The Abrahamic dreams that we can all stand in the same space as equals. while carefully perhaps securing Christian priority behind the scenes. The Hagaramic replies that to be is to inherit. Kinship is the key to property and inheritance. Kinship, the quest to determine who is who, is never separate from the question of who gets what. But the lessons of the Hagaramic are perhaps not simply bleak. Families and solidarities and origins are not given or natural. They are conjured. They rise unexpectedly, like the son born from sex between the patriarch and an Egyptian slave, by human improvisations as miraculous in their way as the promised child bursting from a barren womb. Solidarities and families are called into being by gods and other creators, and they are not tied to the land. They move in and out of the land. The Hagaramic perhaps encourages us to think that there is no ground, no solidarity, no subject, no identity, except that those we produce and sign up to as itinerants. We produce and live our ad hoc solidarities with strangers, even, on occasion, strange old religious archives and their forgotten truths. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. So Yvonne has some time for questions, so I invite you to ask questions, and Yvonne will call on you all, or I'll help her if she needs it. Will.
Tangential, but it was just as you were talking about the Europe forming itself in this after retreat, and in the timing of the sieges of Vienna, I was thinking, not somewhat in that era, as the increasing the Protestant Reformation, the kind of growing obsession with Hebrew biblical texts and kind of new Israelite kingdoms and things. Is that kind of, do you think there's anything to that in terms of trying to create, remove the East into itself, to re-internalize itself?
That's a very interesting question. That's a great question. Just trying to think of a good answer that's not just off the top of my head. You mean like the sort of like the description of the Hebrew republics and in the kind of the shaping of the polity on the grounds of the republic, and the Hebrew republic, and the sort of modelling of Old Testament politics? Yeah.
And it can go in many different ways. So it can be things like trying to make Queen Elizabeth I King David.
Yeah.
And it comes at all kinds of different levels in which they seem to be somehow grasping at wanting to be a new Israel.
Yeah.
And have their Israelite covenants and this and that.
Yeah, I think there's always been so sort of what I'm talking about here is kind of, I mean, I touched down in a way the history here was very slight. I sort of touched down in early modern histories and then came straight into the 20th century in the Abrahamic. But I think this grasping for a biblical foundation, you could trace that, and you could trace the history of that throughout the centuries. And I think there is this sense of sort of wanting to ground yourself in the most ancient foundation, the most ancient polity. To what extent that relates to the kind of the perceived threat of Islam. I mean, it's kind of the self-definition of the Protestant biblical culture, but that's all a truism. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that? I find myself going back to truism and not from you.
If there was a connection between the two.
Yeah, and all these kings like all the Israelite kings who keep cropping up. Yeah. And it's interesting that this is also a different part of the Hebrew Bible. So it's also like the kingdoms, and it's Solomon, and it's David, modelling yourself on. I think that's a wonderful question. I mean, I like thinking about it more. I mean, it is interesting. Sorry, I'm kind of obsessed about that. I mean, it's interesting why these models they're all Hebrew Bible. It's some kind of New Testament politics. It's not Paul. It's Solomon. And I think there is this kind of the ancient foundation, the desire for the most ancient foundation. I think that would relate to the threat of the mimetic Quran, the Quran that seems to reflect your scriptures.
So interesting, so many interesting things to talk about. But in some ways, I think the heart of the paper was in the moment when you went to between the two slides and the sort of the sacrifice and the you know, giving of the slave. And I guess I was thinking about this in relation to, I mean, I hope it's not just because it's alliteration, but so scarcity, sacrifice, and supplement were all important terms for you. And but in a way, so in a way, sacrifice gets written out of this story. I mean, there's no sacrifice. I mean, Hagar is not a sacrifice, or is she? I mean, are you claiming her as the displacement of sacrifice onto the giving of a woman? You know, and the giving of the possibility of something that will, you know, make up for the scarcity, something that will offer. Plenitude of a kind, or are you, or is there a way that sacrifice, or this sort of shows that, you know, just as in using the Abrahamic, now sacrifice is no longer central. In your story too, is sacrifice, in this alternative story, the supplemental figure, is sacrifice no longer central?
Yeah, I think that's a rich question. So you do have a kind of mimetic sacrifice of Ishmael that's already like preceding the sacrifice of Isaac, but it's also related to this. So the story of the sacrifice is where you really make the second son the true son and the only. So he becomes the only, and there's a midrash that says, when God says, take your son, your only son, and Abraham says, I've got two, and it goes like this. But by the end of that story, he is the one, and he's the one through this strange blood sacrifice. And I think, you know, Nancy Jay's arguments about sacrifice's birth done better are really important here. So that kind of secures that line rather than the other. So it's also a sacrifice of Hagar and Ishmael. But I think that Hagar, you could also say that Hagar is very explicitly sacrificed in the text, because sacrifice is a kind of recording of that offering up. And she is, her disappearance, is recorded and is also kind of lamented. And that's what I find really strange. Why not just have her disappeared? Why not just have her go? Why ever even mention this other family, this other offshoot? And so it seems in a way, and in fact the number of verses devoted to Hagar and Ishmael is sort of, it becomes in history a less famous story, but in the terms of Genesis there's more of it. There's this big sort of anxiety. Yeah, and I think the scarcity is exactly right, where you've got that, you know, so why do you have to offer up Isaac? Because the promise, even though the son's there, the nation hasn't yet come, so there's this offering up, but that makes it even more fecund, and he's even more productive. And then why have you got this kind of long delay in the promise? Why have this scarcity that you then need the slave to supplement? The more I think about it, the more I think it's the most perverse kind of origin story, constantly creating difficulties for itself.
Other questions?
On that note, thank you, first of all, this was just absolutely fascinating. You seem to end on a sort of hopeful note. There was something positively destabilizing about paying more attention to the Hagaramic rather than letting it be written out or ignored. But it seems like it could just as well be a counsel of despair. I mean, that there's only one blessing. Only one person gets the land, and maybe there are other tribes where we have to drive them out. And I mean, there's so. It's alarming as well.
Yes.
So I mean, it seems like you're engaged in a sort of productive use that leaves aside the alarming part, just like other people are. You're doing it at such a higher level of sophistication. But I mean, do you worry about the troubling aspect too?
Yeah, oh, I do. I mean, I sort of, in fact, I felt I was always tending towards the bleak and the sort of
yes.
the you know, wanting to attack the bland optimism of the Abrahamic. But I do, I mean, you know, given the way that people refer back to kind of biblical foundations, and given that this is a sort of our origin story, I mean, there must be some real creative potential in the fact that it's sort of finding itself, it just finds it so hard to get over these exclusions, and the fact that her story is told in a self-critical way, and so like, and the story of Esau, and so these stories of displacement, on one hand they're kind of, you know, they're trickster stories and they're stories of celebration of your ascendancy, on the other hand they're kind of really anxious and they're really sort of pained and they're really, and I find that really sort of productive. And at the end I was thinking, actually, all these crazy births, I mean, you know, the only thing that doesn't happen in the Bible is you just have a kind of natural family or a natural birth. That's one thing you can be sure of. And actually you could read all these kind of crazy origins, you know, from the son who's kind of born from a postmenopausal woman to the son who's born from the sex between the Egyptian slave and the patriarch. As these kind of, I was starting to read them as these sort of like births, these eruptions of strange solidarities that aren't to do with, you know, a sort of defensive definition of identity that starts from, well, I am a Christian, or I am a Jew, and these kind of, or political solidarities, or national solidarities. It's almost like it's kind of staging these kind of weird eruptions of family. These gods, I mean, Ward and I talk about a lot about these gods that kind of live and die, and these solidarities that live and die. And it seems to be these strange, mutant solidarities. And I think that there's really, for me, kind of very hopeful political allegories there. But we wouldn't have to be, and that's why I wanted to end with the idea of how weird to sort of create solidarities with these ancient texts, these ancient archives that people, we feel like we've long since kind of moved beyond. So.
Do you find that there's any connection now? See, do you know of any? It seems to me I've encountered people that find the Hagar story encouraging, and it is a very hard story to deal with. You know?
Yeah.
Do you find that now, in the age where marriage is and traditional families are not as common, that this, and also in the age of women being empowered to raise a family? You know, now Hagar ended up raising her son alone, but she was ready to do that. And is that an encouraging story to women and people in general going through hardship and breaking up with traditional family and cultural lines and things like that?
There's been a lot of really good work done around Hagar and African American experience. And so I recently wrote an article. That's what I was thinking of, and I wondered about that.
Yeah,
I recently wrote an article for Interpretation that was about. It was actually kind of looking at the afterlives of Hagar. It's very interesting the way she turns up. She turns up in the work of exiles, or she turns up in the work of people who are displaced, or someone who's writing a treatise trying to improve the social life of prostitutes. And so she has these, she doesn't appear in high culture, she appears in all these sort of strange marginal places. And yes, I think she has always been, certainly for the last couple of centuries, a real source of hope and inspiration on a personal level. And I think it's what's interesting, it must, I mean, what I tried to do with this article was sort of develop it as well on a personal level, with blended families and single parents, and that it's very interesting that the Bible, which we expect to have sort of family values or some kind of, you know, nuclear family model, actually has all these kind of mixed families. I think what I was trying to do more, I was trying to sort of do something on a larger scale and sort of think about what it means in terms of national origins and foundations. But I think that's a very important part of our story.
Yes. Sorry, back here. Sonia.
Yes. Thank you very much. I love this idea of surrogacy instead of as a surrogate for origins. But I wanted to ask you about one sort of how the beginning of your talk, the separation of the Abrahamic against the sort of pagan allegiance to the law. how that sort of maps onto the second half. Especially sort of the quick reading that you did of Galatians, where surprisingly Hagar is aligned with the law and sort of that kind of legalistic aspect. Which I sort of found also a little surprising then that she's recuperated at the end as freedom in the last poem. So I wonder if you could sort of help me map out this relationship of the Hagaramic and the law.
Yeah, I think I was so inevitably sort of touching down various things that I wasn't able to develop quite fully enough. I mean, one of the things I wanted to say is that we kind of reference the Bible as this kind of vacant foundation, and what happens if you restore it and all its kind of complex textuality. But I also wanted to at least gesture to the strange political lives of Abraham, so that in early modernity you do have this idea of a King Abraham who's above the law, because God, he's this like a model of God, and he can break the law because he is the sovereign. And how different that is to this kind of bland, sort of fraternal Abrahamic, so there's sort of many lives of Abraham. The question about the law, I mean, so probably people in the room who could say more and better what's actually going on in Galatians 4, because I wanted to at least gesture to the fact that this, I mean, I'm really perplexed by this wonderful geographical confusion of Arabia and Jerusalem, and at least sort of show how she's kind of all over the place. I mean, on one hand you've got, I think, it's tempting to read it as a kind of Ishmaelization of the Jews and a denigration of Torah. But I know from discussion with some other people in New Testament studies who know more about this than I do, that this might actually be something that's, a lot of the targeting of Jewish law is not as clear as we often think it is in the New Testament, in Paul, or, and for example, is it Bridget Carl or Birgit Carl? Yeah, she reads this as sort of like it's against slavery, it's against colonization, and it's against slavery. So there's lots of different interesting readings of the text, which I kind of, skirted around. What was your last point? The nice link you made with law.
Oh, that was your link. I guess it was sort of like the Abraham part in the relationship to the law was clear sort of to me in the way that you sort of explained. But sort of Hagar kind of stays in this shadier aspect of the law, because she's not sovereign, and yet, as you said, she still sort of acts like a patriarch, and is presented as a patriarch, but she's clearly not sovereign. So she's sort of like in this weird relationship to the law that sort of gives us yet another alternative. If Abraham is the alternative to the sort of legalistic pagans, Hagar is giving us yet another relationship.
No, that's really nice. And also, no one has law, or no one has Torah in Genesis, but you do have circumcision and covenant. And so Hagar and Ishmael come, then you have circumcision and covenant, and Ishmael is circumcised, but he's not covenant. And so you get these kinds of ways of trying to separate, and yet at the same time he is circumcised, and so is part of the house. So thank you.
One more question? Yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, you show it in the birth between with Ishmael and Isaac, and then you relate that to the Jacob and Esau birth. But I'm always puzzled when Esau and Jacob meet in chapter 34, where Jacob is giving him a gift, and he says, I don't need it. But then he changes the word and says, take my blessing. What's going on there? That the blessing is returned.
That's a lovely. I mean, I'll make a note of that because I've forgotten that detail. I mean, also you get, so Jacob and Esau. It's like having to negotiate the crime or the original theft. So Esau comes back. Ishmael doesn't come back in the the same way, but you still have, with Jacob and Esau, you have more of a kind of encounter, and you also have Jacob's terror at meeting his brother and sending all these gifts and all these presents, and I think that you could do a really interesting study of all the gifts and the presents and the overpayments in Genesis, you know, so Abraham pays huge amounts of money for the grave, and there's all these kind of excessive giving, and it kind of relates to the fact that God somehow doesn't give his gift in the beginning in a simple way, so you need the other, you need Hagar and Ishmael, and then you need to kind of compensate them, and you get involved in all these chains of compensation and fear of vengeance or reprisals, and so how do you read the changing of the word to the blessing that somehow is
very
kind
few
of
translations do that. They shut their eyes to it and they just see it's the same gift, but it's the same blessing. And the story that immediately precedes that is where Jacob is wrestling. Who is this figure with whom he's wrestling? Is it himself? Is it God? Is it his brother? And what's the relationship between this struggle and then returning the blessing?
And how could you give the blessing back when you have, originally one gets the blessing, one gets everything, the other one gets the rest, and then they live their life for the next 20 years, and then somehow you're going to have some scene of restitution, and now I'm going to give you your blessing back, but Jacob's the one who has all these presents that he can give to Esau. It's very
the point of the narrator is to say why we are blessed, but then as you pointed out, God says the same thing to Ishmael. To Ishmael. That the same blessing in chapter 16 that God had said to Abram in chapter 15. Now you've got this sort of giving it back.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Yvonne, and thank you, everybody. Oh, there's refreshments outside. I'm sorry, I forgot to announce that part of it. Yes, please come stay, talk, and